In this lecture, we're going to talk about what the isolation raise is, we're going to talk about the type of limping that occurs pre-flop, and then we're going to talk about why we iso raise. So first off, let's talk about what the isolation raise is. So what is it? Well, there's a definition here on the screen for you to read, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it out loud. So an isolation raise is a pre-flop raise that occurs after an opponent limps with the intention to isolate the limper in a heads-up pot post-flop or to win the hand right out pre-flop. So what you should notice here, two takeaways here, is that there's two goals with the isolation raise. Number one goal is we're going to look to isolate a single limper ideally in a heads up pot post flop. So ideally this is going to be a weak opponent that we're going to look to isolate to play heads up post flop. And the secondary goal is to win the hand right out pre-flop without going to the flop. So just win that dead money sitting there in the pot pre-flop and not go to the flop. So we're okay with going heads up versus a limper post-flop, and we're also okay with just winning the hand right out pre-flop. Either or is perfectly fine. Of course, ideally with our higher equity hands, like our stronger broadways or medium to strong pocket pairs, we want to see a flop, post-flop. But with our weaker hands, we're okay with just taking down the money pre-flop. And also, if we're facing multiple opponents, we're fine with taking down the money pre-flop as well, because we know as more people we face in a hand, then the lower equity is in the hand, because everybody has an equity share in the hand. So that's what the isolation raise is. I want to make sure that you understand what it is and what those two primary goals are for it as well. Okay, so now that we know what that is, let's talk about the type of limping that occurs pre-flop. So we're going to define them, and then I'm going to pull up an example from Poker Tracker 4. So there's two different types of limping. There's the open limp, and there's the limp behind or the over limp. We can call it limp behind, over limp. The open limp is the first person that's voluntarily limping into the pot by limping one big blind rather than raising. So for example, if under the gun decides to just put one big blind in the pot rather than raise, that would be considered an open limp. A limp behind or an over limp is when somebody else limps after somebody has already open limped. So it's to limp in pre-flop for one big blind after one or more players have already done so. So to illustrate this, let's go ahead and let's pull up a hand from Poker Tracker 4. We're going to actually talk about this hand later as well. So I'm sitting here with Ace King in the big blind. We get a fold from the first person to act. We get an open limp from the person in the cutoff. So they're the first person to limp, so they're considered the open limper. We get a fold from the button, and then we get another limp from the small blind. So this would be considered either a limp behind or an over limp, whatever you want to call it. So we have the open limp, and then we have the over limp. Those are the two different types of limpers. I want to make sure that you understand the definition here, because you're going to hear people say this from time to time, that somebody open limped or there's an over limper in the hand, and you want to make sure that you understand that terminology. Okay, so let's talk about why we iso raise. So why do we iso raise? Well, I've already kind of talked about this in our first lecture in the course, and we also somewhat defined it when we talked about the isolation raise. So we talked about the reasons for iso raising. So why do we iso raise? What type of opponents are we going to face? Well, typically only weaker opponents will be open limping at the micro stakes. I didn't put over limping in here because a combination of weaker opponents all the way up to really good players will be over limping or limping behind in certain situations. I will be over limping myself from time to time, but typically only weaker opponents will be open limping. A strong opponent is not going to be open limping hands, right? You and I aren't going to be open limping hands like Ace King, Pocket Queens, Pocket Jacks, 9-8 suited, King 10 suited, Ace 5 suited, any hand that we deem worth playing. If the hand isn't opened, if nobody's open to the pot yet, we're either going to open raise or we're going to fold. But a weaker opponent, on the flip side, they're going to open raise hands. Now, in terms of overlimping, we're going to find situations to profitably overlimp. So I made sure I didn't include that in this definition of why we iso raise. So if we think about it, when a weaker opponent limps into a hand, it gives us the opportunity to capitalize on their mistakes. So, right, open limping is a mistake. If we're going to be playing in a poker hand pre-flop, and if the opportunity comes to us to either open raise, limp, or fold, well, we're not going to limp. We're either going to open raise or we're going to fold. So open limping is going to be a mistake, and when this occurs, it gives us the opportunity to capitalize on our opponent's mistake of limping pre-flop. And then it goes back to what we talked about on that initial slide of when we ISO raise, then we have two primary reasons. Either we're looking to ISO raise this weak opponent that's making a mistake post-flop, or we're looking to capitalize on it by taking down their dead money that they put in the pot by open limping pre-flop. So that's going to conclude the short lecture. We talked about what the ISO raise is, we talked about types of limping, and we talked about why we ISO raise. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys at the next lecture.